Hello, Vaughn. Another busy week, and we should plunge right in.
Yes.
Premier Eby labeled the man accused in the Lapu Lapu Day rampage a murderer and told the
Yeah.
legislature that I hope he spends the rest of his goddamn life in jail. Um,
Yes.
Eby himself is a lawyer, but these comments are not sitting well with the Law Society or the Bar Association.
No, it's very unusual. I've covered, as you know, politics, 11 premiers, a lot of attorneys general and MLAs. It's very unusual. There is a standing convention in places that use the British parliamentary system, a lovely Latin term called sub judice. And it basically means that when a matter is before the courts, or the subject of a police investigation, politicians exercise restraint in what they say about the case in the legislature for fear of prejudicing the process or prejudging it. So the premier's comments, and they were spread over 3 days last week. It wasn't just he said it once, he said it a bunch of times, and in the tone you say, and yes, murderer, and yes, spend the rest of his goddamn life in jail. The premier apologized for the goddamn, but he didn't apologize for essentially prejudging the case, denying due process or repudiating it. The Law Society and the Bar Association have both protested that this is not the way that politicians behave around matters like this. They say, Law Society says, if a premier talks like that, it allows ordinary people to disparage the justice system or undermines confidence in it. So very strong words. And the Speaker of the Legislature, Raj Chauhan, also this week reminded members of the House that of the convention, and we don't do this. We don't do this. He didn't name the premier, but everybody knows who he was thinking of. Attorney General said in the legislature on Friday, Nikki Sharma, under pressure from the opposition, she says, members need to be careful about this sort of thing. We need to be cautious. We shouldn't be in any way questioning the independence of the judicial system, talking about matters before the court. So the premier has had a rough ride on this. Harold, he's been very reluctant to back off. He said he had no regrets about what he said, but he did say that he had noted the speaker's comment on the need for caution, and he respected the comment of the speaker. So I think that's as close as we're going to get to David Eby backing off on any of this. One can only hope that he's learned the lesson that so many other politicians have learned, which is don't go there.
What do you think is motivating him in this?
I will say the one thing the Attorney General said yesterday when she talked to us about this, and the Attorney General came out of the legislature, and I'll give her credit. She took a long scrum with reporters on this, and she stayed till we ran out of questions. She said the one thing was you have to realize in the wake of that attack is one of the darkest days in provincial history. And she said, quote, we were all very emotional. I think that's the one bit of context in this that you go, if the premier were to just come out and say, I realize I crossed the line on this upon reflection, I wish I hadn't done it because I respect the convention that we don't do this, I think the public would be entirely forgiving and understanding. And that's essentially what the Attorney General was saying to us, that, it was a very unusual circumstance. Okay, I get that too. And it was an awful thing. But the premier did it over 3 days. And he said plenty of time to acknowledge the convention and say, I get it. He hasn't really done that. And I think that kind of, Eby got very emotional, yes. And he's not very good at backing off and apologizing, even when he's in the wrong.
Well, he and his government are under some heat with over Bill 15, which is, on the face of it, it's designed to eliminate red tape and fast track important infrastructure projects like hospitals and schools. That all sounds like a good idea. So why are so many groups lining up against it?
Well, this legislation, you're right, Bill 15, the Infrastructure Projects Act, public and private infrastructure, introduced in the legislature last Thursday. Not much time to debate it. The main complaint about this legislation is that it's kind of blank check legislation. It doesn't actually remove red tape. It doesn't actually repeal regulations that are in the way of building a school or a hospital or mine, because it covers private projects as well. What it does is it says if the cabinet, in its opinion, thinks the project is politically significant, then the cabinet can arbitrarily clear all the regulatory obstacles. So it allows the government to play favorites and pick and choose. Doesn't say all projects get this relief. It says the ones that the cabinet likes, that they think are politically significant. And that's the basis for the objection. The legislation is arbitrary. It doesn't lay out the precise circumstances in which, this project is entitled to less environmental review or expedited permitting. It also overrules municipalities, and the municipalities say they weren't consulted. And then there's the problem with First Nations. So when British Columbia unanimously in the legislature endorsed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, British Columbia, the government of the day, was still NDP, said going forward, we can't go back and fix every piece of legislation and policy we've passed in the last 150 years. But what we do say is that going forward, when we're bringing in a major piece of legislation that affects the rights, the land, the resources, the communities, Indigenous nations, and that would be pretty much any project in British Columbia. If we're bringing in a major piece of legislation that does that, we're going to work with Indigenous nations before we table the legislation in the House. We're going to work with them. We're going to make sure they're consulted. We're going to make sure they're part of the bill from the get-go. Well, Indigenous nations came out this week, Harold, and they said, you didn't do that. You introduced the legislation in the legislature as a fait accompli, and you didn't do what you said you were going to do to us at the beginning. And the government has pretty much admitted that was the case. They said, we didn't have time because we got to get this piece of legislation through the House before the House adjourns at the end of May. So we didn't have time to consult you. But sort of imagine a First Nations leader listening to this. We're going to consult you afterward. We're going to consult you going forward. So we promise we'll keep you in mind. We're not going to do anything without your approval. But why would you trust the government when it broke its initial word, which was to consult them going in?
And that's the issue. That's a big reason I understand that why the Green Caucus of two came out yesterday opposing the bill as well. But where does that leave the government? They still have enough votes if they want to push this through, I imagine. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they made an agreement with the Greens that said the Greens, when it counts, when it really matters, will vote to support the government. But the government said, well, we think this piece of legislation, this Bill 15, that's a confidence matter. You got to vote for this. Greens said, no, we didn't agree to that. We don't agree to that. We don't agree to you just saying that the government will fall if we don't vote for this. So they came out, and you're right, Harold, they listed their reasons. Legislation is arbitrary, vague, doesn't consider Indigenous relations. They're saying they're not going to vote for it. That leaves this situation. The government has 47 members of the House. That's a majority. If they call a vote on this, and all of the opposition members, so the Conservatives, the people who used to be Conservatives that haven't decided on a new name yet, and the Greens, it'd be a tie, 46 to 46. But the Speaker of the Legislature, who's a New Democrat, Raj Chauhan, is allowed to vote to break ties. And the assumption is the Speaker exercises the vote to keep things moving, to maintain the status quo. And on that basis, I think there's sufficient precedent for the Speaker to say, since the government has said it's going to fall and we'd be into an election, for the Speaker to break the tie. So as long as the New Democrats can get everybody into the House, The vote, they decided this week that they're going to cut off debate and vote on Bill 15, 9 p.m. Wednesday, May 28th. Mark your calendars. And if they get all their members present on that day, and they get all their votes, the opposition ties the vote, the speaker can break the tie and the government doesn't fall and we won't be into an election. But there is an alternative here, which is to concede that the Greens and the Indigenous leaders have a point and hold this bill over to the fall and do the proper consultations this summer. They haven't been able, Harold, to give us an example of a school or a hospital or a mine that right now is being held up by red tape. They've talked about. Yeah.
Sorry, interesting you say that, because I must say I was surprised to read the example that the premier used when he cited delays of completing an unnamed school, saying that
a ditch. The example they give us, they keep giving us, is apparently there was a school project that was held up because there was a ditch on the site, and somebody thought, well, that was a water course, and therefore there had to be a water review, right? But that's past, right? They have not pointed to a specific project like a school or a hospital or a mine that right now is being held up and that right now needs this relief, right? It's all in the past and it's all hypothetical. So if you want this bill through the House by the 28th of May, it strikes me that it would be a very good gesture to Indigenous leaders in particular, the local government, which is protesting, to the Greens and say, okay, we agree, we didn't consult the way we should have on this, and let's see if we can get this thing in shape and ready to go. The legislature sits right after Thanksgiving, and we don't think there's any major projects that's going to be killed or held up between now and then.
I would imagine a lot of taxpayers are wondering, well, why does the session have to arbitrarily end at the end of May? It's not like they sit year round as it is. Why couldn't they extend it for a couple of weeks into June?
Well, yes, they could, and it has happened. And they play this kind of brinkspersonship. They say, we've got our agenda and we don't want to let the opposition talk forever, and the opposition will talk forever. So what we say is they pass something called time allocation, which is it's a modern term for what they used to call closure. But basically, they call it the legislative guillotine. Debate ends on this day, and they've said May 28th. The scheduled end of the legislature session is May 29th. You talk to the government and they say, yeah, well, if we gave the opposition 2 weeks more, they'd fill the time for that too. I think the real problem on this bill is the blank check aspect. There's really it's all cabinet's judgment. The opposition parties have raised is that will invite, existing regulations apply to everyone. This new system creates two classes of project. The ones that the NDP supports and sees political gain in approving, and the ones that get left behind. And that leads to suspicions about political trading and influence trading and governments seeking political advantages. And I think the opposition, the Greens and the Conservatives, are right to be skeptical, and Indigenous people are right to be skeptical because they've already been bypassed in the drafting process, and the government is now saying, but trust us, when we actually do one of these projects, we'll consult you then.
Right. Well, a bit of irony here, isn't it? In my mind, when you look at the local level, for years, places like the city of Vancouver were accused of playing favorites because they were making different decisions behind the scenes on amenities, approvals, and what developers had to pay. And Ravi Kahlon came in and said, we're not going to do that anymore. There has to be a formula to make things transparent. And this is akin to that in some ways, isn't it? Yeah.
That's a good point. You're thinking of investing in a mine project in British Columbia, critical minerals. Lots of talk about the need for it. You look at the rules the way they are, the way they were, and you go, okay, well, that's what we have to go through. And we all have to go through the same process. So my mine and your mine, everybody's mine goes through it. Now they go, wait a minute, if we hire the right lobbying firm, we make friends with the right cabinet minister, and we say, well, we'll do a public platform with you in your riding, and we'll thank you for it. We might get on the fast track. And they're into unknown territory now, because it's political trading and a political opinion that your project is significant. And I think that also raises a big question about how we attract investment to British Columbia and what it takes to get in here.
Interesting. One last thing, the mayor of Vancouver, Ken Sim,
yes,
in an interview this week with our Dan Fumano, expressed continued frustration with the province over not giving his city the legislation that he and his council want to allow them to abolish the elected park board. Why this reluctance in Victoria, do you think?
Well, there's certainly no sympathy here. The premier said this week, tough. He says the government's got a legislative agenda of its own. It's busy. There isn't time in the schedule to put a bill in that would do that. And the mayor, the soonest they can get to this is the fall. He gave the same set of excuses last year, except last year, the election was coming too. But, I think the reason is that the government doesn't believe that its own supporters in Vancouver support the mayor in this. They think the mayor is in political trouble. They're not sorry that he is. I mean, if you think about it, former Vancouver City Councillor Christine Boyle, who's no fan of Ken Sim, she sat on council with him in his opposition. She's now a provincial cabinet minister, and one can only guess at what she says if she gets asked around the cabinet table. Do you think we should push this along for our pal Ken Sim? I can imagine what she might say. And I suspect there are a lot of other New Democrats in Vancouver who are quite happy to see Ken Sim frustrated on this.
Right. And so at this point, with the city election in the fall of 2026,
yes,
if they lag the puck much longer, we're probably looking at more likely some sort of a referendum question than a legislative change right now.
Yeah, I think that's true. And look, Dan Fumano's done a great job of covering this story, but I don't think, from reading his coverage, I don't think Ken Sim has won the public relations battle around this. And I have to say, as a former resident of Vancouver who's watched this from afar for some time, it does take a certain amount of political skill to lose a public relations battle with the Vancouver Park Board. But apparently Ken Sim has done that.
Not only that, he lost a bunch of his ABC Park Board commissioners, didn't he? I mean, he has fewer people on council, on Park Board, on school board than he had at the beginning.
We're in for an interesting run with him, actually. Yeah. Not that the New Democrats are all that popular because they won the election with 1 seat and 22 votes, but they have got virtually every seat in Vancouver, except the one represented by Dallas Brody, former Conservative, now Independent. So the New Democrats have got a pretty good hold on the city of Vancouver.
Right. All right. Thanks, Vaughn. That was another informative session, and look forward to chatting again next week.